Shana Tova. Growing up, I thought that I was the only one. I thought it was just me. I was this kid in Hebrew school who didn't have a Jewish name, and I didn't quite look Jewish back then either. I had really bright blonde hair and was named Nick. And then on the other side of it, when my dad dragged me to church Sunday school on the weekends he had custody of me to try and make me be Christian, I was suddenly the self-professed Jew in a church classroom where we were just finished learning that the Jews had killed Jesus. Not to put too fine a point on it, but that's really uncomfortable, actually. That's really awkward. So now for a tale of two civilizations. This summer I spent some time with my dad's family. This was complicated for reasons that I'll get into, but we went away for a few days with them. They're very generous and have nothing but love for us, but these things are complicated. Certainly as a rabbi, but for me, just as a Jew. Now, for those keeping score, my dad's family is Protestant Christian. Methodist, to be precise. My dad's family were German Protestant, and if you see family pictures, you actually see my resemblance in my grandmother, in her Irish family. It's where the name Nicholas came from, was that part of the family. My dad's family came out of the Midwest, and my grandparents settled in the South. When I was little, my parents divorced, and I grew up with my mom and her family. They were Reform Jews, and they came from New York and the Jersey suburbs. My grandparents lived most of their lives in the D.C. area. My parents met in college at UVA, and they moved to North Carolina before I was born. Growing up within very different families, I grew up with a couple of different identities, in fact. Grew up exposed to different values and value systems. It's probably taken me 10 years to begin to make sense of some of the experience. And I'll share a moment of clarity I experienced with the whole thing. It happened while I was watching a movie called The Departed. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's this gangster movie from 10 years ago and set in Boston. There was this line from the script. I actually went and looked up that line when I was writing this devar, thinking about it. One of the guys is talking to Matt Damon's character on living a double life. And he said, "So you begin your life. One kid with your old man, one kid with your mother. You're upper middle class during the week, and then dropping your Oz and hanging out with your dad on the weekends. You have different accents. You did, didn't you? You were different people." So I saw this movie when I was, 19 in college, and this sequence just blew me away. It was like someone was telling my story to me about what it was like to grow up between moms and dads. Now, don't get me wrong, in both of those families, they did have commonalities. They both deeply valued education, for instance. I think about my mom's mother, a librarian who values careful, precise speech and is very well spoken. And then my dad's mother, Zichronah Livracha. She had this amazing command of Latin, and she understood all the roots of so many words that we just take for granted in the English language today. But these were different worlds, in fact. One was politically progressive, and the other was quite conservative. When I heard that movie line about speaking with different accents, that hit me like a ton of bricks. Somewhere along the line, without even realizing it, I had learned to speak with different accents. I had slightly different personalities. At my mom's, I was overflowing with conversation and debate, and we would be arguing. It sounded like this sort of Jewish family gathered around the dinner table arguing or having this conversation or whatever. My dad's, I was more circumspect. I had Southern speech mannerisms and patterns. Things like y'all would come up with greater regularity in who I was. And I certainly didn't argue with anyone in the family. I have to tell you that to this day, my dad, my stepmom, and their family have been nothing less than supportive of the fact that I wound up Jewish. That's a story for another time, though. And while I remember my dad's own trepidation when I first told him I wanted to go to rabbinical school of all things, he has ultimately been profoundly supportive of me throughout the journey. And yet it is inescapable that I come from these different places. So to circle back, Kimmy and I were spending time with some of my Christian family this summer. We were at dinner one night, and we were talking about relatives who spoke with very little self-censorship. I was talking about one of my Jewish relatives who died a few years ago. I mentioned his name to my Christian family, and one of my Christian relatives said in response, "Oh yeah, if you imagine the worst of a New York Jew, the most obnoxious New York Jews that there are, he was that. That's who he was. Okay. I sort of tried to correct it and say, well, he was kind of an abrasive guy, which was kind of the truth. But my dear relative persisted and said, no, yeah, he was the worst of those New York Jews. He was all of that, everything that you imagine that you can't stand about New York Jews, that's who he was. So in this moment, there's a lot going on for me. First, that side of my family has very little, well, really no use for any kind of, being delicate, or what they might characterize as political correctness. I disagree with them about some of their characterizations, but I can appreciate their honesty and for being my family, who I love and I miss here. And yet, these were also Christians who were tarring one of my relatives with some trope that to me felt really anti-Semitic, actually. Now, my Jewish grandparents don't much reflect some of these stereotypes and generalizations that my other family was talking about, but it's still part of my legacy. It's part of my identity. And there's the fact that here's Kimmy, my wife, who is the daughter of parents and grandparents who are of the Jewish community of Philadelphia. It's 2 hours from New York, but it's still the same culture. So what did I do? What does one do in this moment? I think I'd be well within my rights to confront my family, and I could have done so with real anger. I'm a rabbi. You're going to sit here and talk to me about how obnoxious this group of Jews are? No, I'm not having that. But then there's another option. I didn't have to confront them. I could let it go. I could forgive somebody who hadn't even asked for forgiveness. And in some ways, I think being a child of a very different set of cultures teaches this kind of forgiveness, this kind of tolerance, which actually, I think in its own way, is a form of love. I could have seized on this moment to instruct, to correct, to excoriate, but I also realized the limitation of doing so with someone who didn't even grow up knowing Jewish people, who didn't know Jews, who doesn't understand what that sounds like or feels like. I also recognize that underlying some of this reality, some of this tension, is the still living enmity, the discomfort that my two families still hold for one another following this acrimonious divorce between my parents and years of court struggles. So I sought to answer what I experienced to be anti-Semitism with what I think is some of the best, the finest of Jewish tradition. I chose not to fight fire with fire. You see, there's a principle in Judaism. It's called Shalom Bayit. It literally means peace in the home. And to me, this is an article of absolute faith. There are times when this even looks radical. But here's my perspective on the matter. As a child of divorce, I get what it looks like when Shalom Bayit, when peace in the home doesn't just fail, it is in fact obliterated. What it feels like when Shalom Bayit is shattered through anger and viciousness over 15 years. Now, returning to this ugly remark, the fact that I didn't confront my Christian family is not to argue for some kind of Jewish obsequiousness, some kind of infinite pious tolerance, but it is about weighing values. There are plenty of contexts in which I would challenge this, I would attack a statement like that, and there are places in which I would choose to let my love for people, particularly my family, serve as my guiding principle. So what does all of this mean? Well, look, I have two families, one of whom is different from me and capable of real offense, but they don't love me any less. That's the reality of it. It's not always easy for me, and I know it's not always easy for them. In fact, even when it's hard or ugly, I truly believe that my dad and his family, they're really doing the best that they can. So even if they say something that strikes me the wrong way, that rubs me the wrong way, that I might even find offensive, my Torah is to do everything I can to hold them, because even when it's hard, I believe that we're really doing the best we can in this world, and that is something that's true. As I reflect on growing up with two families and feeling like two different people, I learned something over time, that what I said in the beginning, that I thought it was just me, well, it's not just me. I used to think it was, but it really wasn't. Now, some people have experiences that are easier or more difficult than mine, but growing up in this liminal space between identities is more uncommon than I understood as a kid, certainly. What I've come to learn is that as a rabbi, this reality is not particular to me. This is actually an intrinsic and authentic part of the contemporary Jewish experience. And the conversation has changed over time. I grew up with real debates about intermarriage, for instance. I grew up with Rabbi Steve Sager in Congregation Bethel in Durham, North Carolina. It was a conservative shul, and I happened to grow up there because that was the community that was willing to accept me as a child of intermarriage. Other ones did not. And I realized that as this conversation changes over time, people deal with it in different ways. These blurring of lines between identity. I remember a woman in a grocery store in Jerusalem speaking to me in Hebrew who took one look at me and couldn't believe I was Jewish because of what I looked like. I remember a candidate for rabbinical school a couple of years ago who I met when I was a student rabbi. He confided in me, he said, "I want to tell you a secret. My first name is actually Nicholas, like yours." But he went by his middle name, which was a traditional Jewish name. He said he didn't want people questioning whether or not he was Jewish. And he spoke with both an admiration on one hand, but a certain incredulity that I would actually choose to wear this name, Nick, in a professional Jewish life. I told him, look, I understand. I've heard some of that too. There are a lot of sages in Jewish texts that don't have biblical Jewish names. I think of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos in the Talmud. Some of my students, we've learned him together. He's a complicated figure, but the brilliance of his Torah is never in question. And this name, Ben Hyrcanos, Hyrcanos is a Greek name, just like mine. Or another example. In the Middle Ages, I'm reminded of Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. He lived in Muslim Spain about 1,000 years ago. The Ibn in his name, Ibn Ezra, is the same as the Hebrew Ben, except it's Arabic. He wasn't cloistered off in some yeshiva somewhere, out of touch with the outside world. In fact, it was through his connection with Muslim society in his age that he wrote Hebrew language treatises on mathematics, physics, religious philosophy, and Torah. He was the first to actually create any kind of Hebrew grammar, a system of it, which he did because he understood Arabic. That's actually what taught him how to systematize the entire language. He's still regarded as one of Judaism's most brilliant rabbis, and I learned a lot of Ibn Ezra Torah commentary while studying at an Orthodox school in Jerusalem. So I know there's a lot of fretting about Jewish assimilation and worry that we're losing our Judaism today. This is some of this conversation that you hear. We're losing touch with something. But that said, I just offered two examples, two counterpoints to that Jewish history is actually replete with example of how Judaism has had relationships with so many different neighbors over time and been enriched by it. That's not to say the neighbors have always been friendly. It's fair. We can wait a few days for the Yom Kippur martyrology, and we'll see plenty of examples to that speak to that reality. But the places and times in history in which we have had good and positive, fruitful relationships with other peoples, Judaism hasn't somehow lost itself. On the contrary, it has grown. It has been enriched by the encounter. I just mentioned Ben Hyrcanos and Ibn Ezra. They're just two examples, but they tell us a great deal. In contemporary times, Reconstructionist Judaism has language to address this dynamic. In fact, one of the things that moved me the most about Reconstructionism when I first started learning about it was Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan's idea that we live in two civilizations. We live here in the West, in the United States, in Pacific Palisades, in LA, and we live in Judaism. We live in our cycles of time, our holidays, all of our structures, our celebrations, the consciousness through which we see ourselves and our journeys and our families. And living in both of them at the same time is totally possible. This isn't a zero-sum dynamic of identity. To live in the West does not preclude a full and rich Jewish identity. And living as a Jew and a rabbi, no less, does not somehow remove me from the tapestry of contemporary American life. Now, there are fundamentalists, both religious and secular, in fact, who would say otherwise. There are those that would say that to be part of the contemporary landscape of multiculturalism, one should surrender anything particular about one's affiliation with peoplehood, Jewish peoplehood. I've heard it called tribalism before. On the other hand, I've heard it said that to be Jewish, you need to live in a certain kind of cultural and collective isolation from the rest of the world, lest you be infected with profane Western ideas. As a Reconstructionist rabbi, I'm standing here today to tell you that neither of these realities is the case. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan asserts that we as contemporary Jews live in two civilizations. He's right. It is complex, it isn't always easy, and where I believe that the Judaism that we know today may look totally different in 100 years or 500 years, this dynamic has always been part of the Jewish people, and I have utter conviction in the vibrancy of the Jewish future. This is real in our community. This is something that we live in a concrete way. In fact, it's basically why I chose to come here upon my rabbinic ordination at KI, to KI, rather than pursue my previous plan of being a Hillel rabbi. That this community's starting position is uplifting. It is not a position that we are guardians of borders and boundaries and identity to figure out who it is that we want to keep out. This is not what we hold here. This is a congregation that understands intuitively the multifaceted and variegated nature of Jewish identity today. And with this understanding, this is a community that as its baseline position speaks from love. I saw that when I very first visited here, when I came to interview in January, not this past January, but the year before. It continues to be the guiding star, now that I've been here for a year, that constitutes who we are as Kehillah Kedusha, as sacred community. It's a principle I heard articulated from our Rabbi Emeritus, Stephen Carr Rubin, from our senior Rabbi, Amy Bernstein, and it shines through the people I've grown to know and love. But this isn't just an abstract principle. I'm reminded of one of my bat mitzvah students, actually, in terms of how this is a lived reality. She grew up in a couple of different faith traditions, and she made the choice herself to have a bat mitzvah and be Jewish. She saw a reflection of herself within the pool of the traditions of our people. And despite not having a single Jewish name in English, like your rabbi, Rabbi Nicholas Patterson Renner, she saw her story reflected in that of our people. In our sessions preparing for her bat mitzvah, she loved diving into our stories and texts and swimming with these ideas and what it meant to be Jewish. When she looked at this shimmering pool that is Jewish civilization and heritage, she saw her own reflection in the waters. And that's what speaks to me. So whether you who are here today, whether you grew up Orthodox, steeped and suffused with the beauty and richness of Jewish tradition, if you didn't grow up Jewish at all, if you converted along the way, and maybe it was out of a spiritual search, a quest, or maybe it was because someone you loved was Jewish and you wanted to be part of that journey. Maybe you grew up nominally Jewish. You had a bar mitzvah back in the day, but it'd be tough for you to put two Hebrew words in front of each other today. Or maybe you're not even Jewish. Maybe you're sitting here because someone you love is Jewish, and you're part of the journey in that sense. No matter what, if you look at the pool of Jewish stories and Jewish civilizations from wherever it is you sit today, and you see yourself reflected in those waters, then you're part of the journey. And I'm honored to be part of it with you. So I can't help but think that Judaism isn't just one text, one code, or one document. Ultimately, it comes down to our people and our relationship with all of it. This is what makes Judaism immutable. Makes it something that infinite, that has lived through thousands of years of, well, everything we'll hear about on Yom Kippur. That Judaism is about the relationship with our history, our text, and our Torah, but it's how we interact with these things. It's how we live in community, within families, and how we see ourselves reflected in the pool of Jewish heritage. So all of that is what gives me hope for a vibrant and beautiful future. And I'm honored to be on the journey with all of you here today. Shana Tova.